Hello, everybody, and I bring you today an interview with Richard C. Cook, who's written an excellent book, Our Country Then and Now. It's probably the best history of the United States I've ever read. If you're interested as to how we got into the state that we're in now, Richard's book is probably the foremost guide to the moment. He's a former federal analyst with almost 4 decades of experience in the U.S. government. It was Richard who alerted NASA to the faulty O-rings in the Challenger space shuttle. He went on to work with the U.S. Treasury, which furnished him with many of the insights shared in his peerless history of the United States, Our Country Then and Now. Hello, Richard, and thank you for coming.
Hello, nice to be here.
Jolly good. Well, having read this outstanding account of the birth and some might say death of the American Republic, I've asked you to speak to us on the subject of the state of the United States and how we got to where we are today. So, perhaps the first thing to ask you is, why did you write an account of the United States?
Well, I've been a student of history most of my life. Apart from the government, I taught history at the secondary level. My mother was a tour guide for Colonial Williamsburg for 25 years. And so we were steeped in American colonial history. And then as I worked through the government and saw firsthand the events of the late 20th century period, I was involved in the Challenger disaster, and I wrote a history of that I couldn't actually publish until my retirement in 2007. But when I was at the Treasury Department, I began to do a very detailed study of U.S. financial and monetary history. I also wrote a book on that topic called We Hold These Truths, The Hope of Monetary Reform. I continued to write articles on the internet after retiring and in some print venues. But a time came when I felt that I really needed to pull together everything I'd ever studied. And the catalyst for this was that I began to work with my cousin in Texas, who was compiling a family history of our whole American lineage going back to when our first ancestors arrived in Massachusetts from England in the 1630s. And so Johnny and I really began to study this. I also had information about Native American ancestry popping out through my French-Canadian forebears. And so I just felt it was time for me to sit down and write everything that I felt I knew and understood about how we got to where we are today in the disastrous world situation, with the United States a kind of a focal point of everything that is going wrong. And so I wrote the book. It took me about 2 years to do everything, and found a publisher who jumped right in and did excellent work with the editing. And we came out with this book in October of last year, and it's been quite successful. I've added to it a Substack that I do with 2 other very close friends, as we call it the Three Sages Substack. And I began to work with the Veterans Today website, which is now VT Foreign Policy. And with them, we set up an entity we call the American Geopolitical Institute. So with all of these different irons in the fire, I become very, very busy studying what's going on today in the world, in the United States, and also promoting the book, the articles, and meeting an awful lot of people that have really helped me with my understanding and helped me to get my message out, and you're one of them.
Well, that's very kind of you. But the thing is that what with the omni-crisis or poly-crisis, you might say, that's facing the United States and the West, practically everyone has an opinion about it. But I should say few people's opinion is qualified by as much expertise and insight as yours. And one of the things that I find remarkable about your book is that you stress the impact of fractional reserve banking, and saying It was transformative on the USA. So can you explain what fractional reserve banking is and why it matters?
Fractional reserve banking is a system of money creation that came out of the Middle Ages. And it was discovered by the gold merchants of Europe, who worked very closely with the military, political, and religious establishment. The basic idea being that you had a precious commodity, gold, and people brought it to you for safekeeping and storage. And so instead of it just sitting there in the vault, they began to write promissory notes on that stored gold, which became money. These pieces of paper began to circulate throughout the medieval and then the Renaissance economy as money. as cash because you could take it to the gold merchant and cash that in for metallic gold. Now, they soon discovered, though, that they could write promissory notes on that gold far in excess of the actual gold they held in their vault. Say you had a gold that was valued at, using U.S. currency, $100. Well, you began to write promissory notes on that that you would spend in circulation for $1,000. So $100 worth of gold created $1,000 worth of paper. That system began to circulate throughout Europe, and the really key turning point came around the year 1500, because up until that time, the church, the Catholic Church in Europe, had outlawed usury. Usury being the charging of a fee for the issuance of paper money, the issuance of a loan. In a percentage, you had to pay back more than you had borrowed. And as I say, this was against canon law. It was considered a mortal sin until around the year 1500, when the bankers of Germany began to work with the Pope to allow them to issue money at interest. And this whole usury financial reserve system caused the availability of paper money in Europe to explode. And it was fed by the discovery of gold in the Americas that the Spanish brought over, that the English began to get hold of through piracy. And so the gold base grew in Europe, and that allowed a tremendous growth in paper money. And that's what the fortunes of the European banking oligarchy was built on. That system did not exist in the Americas until the American Revolution. Until that time, all money was based on land, on commodities. A little bit of coinage had seeped in through trade, but there were no banks in the United States until 1781, when the founding fathers began to create a banking system in the United States. The first bank was the Bank of North America that was set up in Philadelphia in 1781. And then that became, after the U.S. Constitution was written, the first Bank of the United States, which was set up under Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury in the first Washington administration. And from that point on, fractional reserve banking at usurious rates of interest became the predominant form of money creation in the United States, and has continued so today. But there's another feature here that's very important for people to understand. The whole system rests upon the borrowing of money by the central government, by the United States government. This was a system that came into Great Britain in 1688, when the financial system that was based at that time in Amsterdam came over into Great Britain with the Glorious Revolution and the accession of William and Mary to the throne. And that's when the Bank of England was created. And the whole system is based upon the central government borrowing money, issuing bonds, and those bonds became then the collateral for the creation of the entire banking system that was really privately owned by private investors who held stock in the bank. When Hamilton created the first bank in the United States, he imported the system of money creation based upon the issuance of federal government debt. And that's the system that gradually took over the entire financial system of the United States, to the point where you cannot have a money system unless the federal government goes deeper and deeper into debt. And today that has exploded into a figure in excess of $34 trillion, which is the amount of money the federal government owes to investors, including foreign governments like China, Korea, Japan, European countries, and so on. That's how money is created in the United States. So you have this massive debt pyramid where everyone is in debt at some level to the people who control the system, And the people who control the system are the big bankers, both in the United States and primarily in Europe and other parts of the developed world. But this massive debt-based financial system always creates a requirement to pay back more than has been borrowed. So gradually, two things happen. One is all of the money, all of the liquidity flows into the hands of the big bankers and the big financiers. And at the same time, in order to escape that debt burden, everybody else in society inflates the currency by charging more and more for the products that they sell. So eventually, the monetary system implodes and self-destructs. And that is what we are seeing today.
Well, that's an excellent appraisal of the banking system and how we got into this looming financial crisis. I would like to ask you, how does this fractional reserve banking system, how does it relate to the international power structure that we might call the U.S. empire?
Well, the U.S. empire is part of a larger empire. It's part of a financial empire, which, and the term that we use today is globalism. And that's what globalism is. And you go back in my book, I've got a chapter called The Rockefeller Republic. And the Rockefeller Republic refers to the period after World War II, when the Rockefeller family, particularly David Rockefeller, the big New York banker, essentially led the movement to internationalize the entire global banking system under the control of the big financiers. So they all merged together. The controlling institution for this is the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, which has membership of all of the major central banks in the West. And so the whole system operates as one unit and becomes interchangeable. Probably the biggest banking center continues to be London, because they found a way to transform the dollar into what they call the euro dollar and control the banking system from there, and with all of their offshore tax havens. Because one of the keys to all this is to avoid taxation. And so the big bankers have all kinds of ways to avoid taxation by centralizing their operations at these offshore tax havens. But the big banking centers are London, New York, to some extent Paris, and then you've got in the East, you've got places like Hong Kong, Bombay, other nodes of the international banking system. But it all operates essentially as one unit. And it's a system that nobody outside the structure understands. It's a system that governments have no control over. And it's a system that has its own control over the political process in every country. And so that's why nothing can change in the internal politics, countries such as the United States or Britain or Europe and so on, because the banking system constantly keeps the political system under its heel, creates chaos within the political system, always is setting different parties against each other in this charade that we're now seeing in particular in the United States. But it's all a control mechanism. It's all to keep any government away from controlling or regulating the financial system, which runs on its own. And then, of course, they've got their own ways now of creating massive amounts of money outside of the government debt system, such as derivatives, cyber currencies, and other shadow systems that are ways of creating money that do not require any government participation at all. And of course, that's another reason for inflation, because every time the banking system creates a new type of its own currency, it inflates the amount of money in circulation, drives up prices, and destroys the producing economy. And that's why we see, for instance, the tremendous inflation in housing in the United States, in Britain, in Europe, and elsewhere. And let me simply add to this. This is the system that the nations of the East, including Russia, now becoming an ally of China, India, the whole BRICS phenomenon is a way for other nations, particularly the Eastern and global South, to escape from this collapsing financial structure that the West has created that's dragging the world down. And the only way that the Western financial system can survive is to continue to take over the assets and the resources of the Eastern and Southern countries. And that's where Russia stepped in and said, no, we're not going to do this anymore. And so they're creating an alternative currency system, an alternative financial system that is now standing against the West. And the whole world now is dividing into these two camps based upon the attempt by the West to take over everybody else's economy and the resistance of the East to that. So all this is going on. But to really understand this, you have to know the history. You have to see where it came from, why it exists, who's in charge of it. And in order to do that, my avenue was going back in American history, because the United States, being the largest world economy, was kind of the poster child for the takeover of the world by finance. And they did do this. They did try to do this. And it is now collapsing. And so we're seeing the results of that.
Well, that's a fascinating appraisal of the current state of affairs, and one that has obvious geopolitical import. I think your analysis of the United States is excellent and peerless, but it also functions as a prism through which to understand the complexities facing the world crisis, if you like. Now, I was going to ask you, how would you describe the political ideology of the current dispensation in the West?
Well, the political ideology is basically to destroy the nation state, because the nation state is the repository of value for ordinary working people, people who have real jobs, who do real production within the economy. And it's been the nation state that has been the attempt to organize society, to regulate the financial system, and to make money the servant of production and of daily life and of ordinary values, rather than the plaything of the rich and the very rich. And so the nation state has become the repository of real human values, including, I would say, spiritual values. I have a friend, my friend and colleague, who's part of the Three Sages. His name is Fadi Lama. He was born in Bethlehem, and his family was driven out by Israel in the 1940s, and he now writes out of the Middle East elsewhere. But he calls it the civilizational structure, that we're now seeing civilizations such as the Chinese civilization, the Indian civilization, the Russian civilization, asserting the values of their culture that goes back deep into their history. And one of the things I wanted to demonstrate in my book was that the United States also has a civilizational history. My forebears were English Puritans who came to America in the 1630s for religious freedom. There have been many other peoples who came for religious freedom, and they met a very ancient culture, the Native American culture, that also had religious freedom. And it was these people who created the American nation in the American Revolution that was very quickly taken over by the international banking system. But it was an attempt to create an American nation that I believe still exists. And if you look at what's going on politically now, I don't know if you saw the speech that was given by J.D. Vance, current Republican vice presidential nominee, at the Republican National Convention. He said some very interesting things. One of the most important things he said was, yes, American history is an idea. It's an idea of freedom, but it's also the representation of living people, living human beings, and this is what makes us a nation. And the use of the word nation is anathema to the globalists. It's anathema to the political party in the United States that's trying to tear down our nation. And that's, of course, the Democratic Party, what they have become. And you go over to Europe, and the people who are most feared and most fought against are people like Orban in Hungary, who speaks of nationalist values. And you're seeing the same thing, I believe, in Great Britain in the reaction against the conservatives. You're seeing people reawaken to the idea of nationhood, of civilizational values. And that's what interests me most today about the political situation in the United States. Can that really come back into prominence and into power? That's what we're watching to see if that can happen.
So do you think that the attempt to destroy the nation through this dispensation, this liberal ideology we have today, do you think it's failed?
I think we are now at a crisis point. I personally think it has failed because we're seeing such a strong reaction against it. One of the ways that this struggle is manifesting right now, the biggest political issue in the current U.S. election is the border crisis, where the Biden administration has allowed, and figures are pretty hard to find, but people estimate that in the last 4 years, Biden administration has allowed between 10 and 20 million illegal immigrants to cross the U.S. borders and to begin to settle in the big cities, the big Democratic-controlled cities in the United States. And the purpose of that, and I've written about this, the purpose of that is to get these people to vote in the upcoming election, to vote for the Democratic Party, to keep them in power, because it's the only way the Democrats can win this election is by the harvesting of millions of votes. And the illegal aliens don't really vote. Their presence is counted within a state jurisdiction, and then documents, ballots are issued that the Democratic Party then gets hold of and submits to be counted in the election. And this is what they're counting on to defeat Trump. And everybody knows it. But whether it can be stopped, that's the real battleground now going into the 2024 election, because that's what they're counting on to elect Kamala Harris.
Well, that's astonishing. I mean, we've seen similar measures taking place to suppress opposition in France, where Marine Le Pen's party has been locked out of government. She says that makes the government illegitimate.
Right.
The Germans have increasingly threatened, to criminalize the Alternative für Deutschland, which is now the second most popular party in Germany following the European elections. And of course, in Ireland, I've recently documented myself, the fact that mass migration has resulted in NGOs and political parties busing migrants to polling stations in order to vote, and I quote, correctly, which is to vote for the politicians who intentionally replace Irish votes with foreign ones to remain in power. Right. But as this is routinely dismissed as a conspiracy theory, but it's obviously taking place before our eyes. But another plan that you've spoken about, which I found was a remarkable section in your book, was basically Trump and the plan to remove Donald Trump. And you mentioned 1,000 days. Could you tell us some more about that section?
I came across a fascinating article by an Indian journalist, Asian Indian. He had done the research, and he'd outlined a plan that was put into place to get rid of Trump even before he had been inaugurated president. And the term that he used to designate the people who were behind this plan was the Shadowmen. And the Shadowmen are a secret society. And of course, by using the word secret society, we go back to a long way in history. And I put this in my book also. Cecil Rhodes had a plan to form a secret society. And one of the intentions of that plan was, and I quote, to recover America for the British Empire. It happened through World War I and through World War II. As we know, the United States, at least on the surface, became the senior partner in the imperial enterprise. which meant that they had the military muscle that was used and is still used today to keep the empire under control. So the Shadowmen has been around for a long time. It's the Shadowmen that assassinated John Kennedy. And we could go into a great deal of detail about specific names and who these people were. The modern Shadowmen, the best example I can use, and I'm safe in doing this because he's not around anymore, is Henry Kissinger. He was the lead architect of the Rockefeller Empire, and of course, his reach was very wide across the entire spectrum of Western governance. But the Shadowmen, their candidate for president in 2016 was Hillary Clinton. This was after Obama had been president for 8 years. And what this journalist said was the Shadowmen had house-trained Obama to do what they wanted. And that they did it very quickly within the first year of his administration. I mean, who else could have gotten Obama the Nobel Peace Prize, for goodness sake? The designated successor to Obama was Hillary Clinton. And of course, Hillary Clinton had already been house trained as Obama's Secretary of State. Much to the surprise of everybody, including Trump himself, they say Donald Trump was elected president in 2016. And to me, that proved that the Shadowmen and the international globalist elite don't control everything. That somehow the American system and the American voter still had enough power to elect a non-controlled figure in this strange bird, Donald Trump. We know Trump had wanted to be president his whole adult life. So clearly here was somebody, but he came out of a different world than the house-trained Washington politicians. So as soon as Trump was elected president, and this, of course, was, mind you, was after Russiagate, when Hillary Clinton tried to pin his victory on Russia, the Shadowmen went into motion and put together a plan to get rid of Trump. And their plan was to get rid of Trump through impeachment. Within days of Trump's inauguration, the plan to impeach him was put into motion. And my book goes into considerable detail about exactly how they did this. But the amazing thing is, they were going to do it within 1,000 days. Trump was impeached 1,057 days after his inauguration. The impeachment failed. It didn't work because they didn't have enough Republican senators on board, which again proves that there is some degree of resilience behind American nationhood, that they couldn't get enough votes in the Senate to convict him. So he was acquitted. And so he continued in office. Well, they tried again. They rigged the 2020 election through these phony ballots that came out of the COVID pandemic, which I believe was also a project of the Shadowmen, because it allowed vast numbers of absentee ballots to appear, and nobody knew where these absentee ballots came from or went to, but they were enough to elect the next house-trained figure who was handpicked by Obama, and that was Joe Biden. Trump and his party, of course, as we know, didn't go along with all this. And I do believe Trump had in the White House figures who were whispering in his ear, well, you got to fight this. You got to send a crowd to the Capitol. And of course, the FBI was at the Capitol telling people to break in and, go this way and go that way. So the whole lawfare where they were going to make darn sure Trump was not going to make a comeback. And so they've gotten him indicted and convicted for all kinds of trumped up charges. But lo and behold, that's failing. And Trump is back. Trump never went away. Biden's the one who has collapsed. literally. And so the whole scheme by the Shadowmen to get rid of Trump has failed. Although we had on January or July the 13th a shooting, we still don't know what happened there. But apparently Trump was injured, and so they failed again. And now they have a true populist in J.D. Vance on the ballot with Trump, who's already out there attacking Kamala Harris as the next fake candidate that Shadowmen are putting forth. So we have a true battle, and it's being called a civil war in the United States. I think that's an apt characterization. And we do not know today what is going to happen over the next 4 months with this election coming up. But it's a very critical election between what has been called the internationalists, what we call the globalists, and the true nationalism of the American people that they tried to create and have held on to over 4 centuries. So it's a very remarkable culmination of all of these historic forces coming to play.
Well, there are many people who would criticize Trump, say people who range from saying that he's a fake himself, that because of his obvious character flaws, he's no good, because of the certain objections to Vance and Trump's policy platform, they would abandon him for that reason. So you not only believe that Trump is genuine in his convictions, that he's sincere, and that so is Vance, but could you explain why is it so important to remove, discredit, or even kill him? Why do his political enemies take it so seriously then?
What you say makes me think of Leo Tolstoy, his great book, War and Peace. Tolstoy said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that great men, it doesn't matter too much about their personal characteristics. A great man is a human being. So he has all the same character foibles that any of us ordinary people have. But what a great man does is he embodies a movement of history. And there was this general who defeated Napoleon. He was a nobody. He knew he was a nobody. And yet he defeated Napoleon and made all the big decisions that trapped Napoleon in Moscow, and Moscow burned, and Napoleon retreated and lost most of his army. That was not the sterling qualities of that Russian general that did that. It was that Russian general embodied the historical fact that nobody coming out of Europe can conquer Russia. Trump is a great man, but he embodies an idea of American nationhood that maybe even he does not truly understand. I think J.D. Vance understands it a lot better than Trump does, which is why Trump picked him, because he saw in Vance an embodiment of the American idea. The character I liken most to J.D. Vance is Andrew Jackson, President of the United States in the 1820s. It's remarkable. He's a Scots-Irish descendant, born in Kentucky. Pretty strange. You look at some of the parallels between J.D. Vance. And again, we're looking at historical movements, great movements of history, great ideas of history, not the foibles and characteristics of individuals. So they're jumping on all of Trump's foibles as somehow indicative of somebody you don't want to be president. But you delve into people like Biden, who's essentially one of the biggest crooks in Washington. And everybody knows that in Washington. So you can't just focus on, what a TV show or a magazine can come up with to attack somebody. You have to look at the great movements of history. And Trump is a representative of a great movement of American history. And you can find parallels to Trump going back to colonial days. And he somehow has the ability, his antennae are always out. These people have the ability to pick up waves of emotion, waves of spiritual value. And Trump says, God save me. Now, is Trump a religious man? No, you wouldn't say he was. But Trump certainly has a spirit and a soul that is sensitive to history. And I think that's what we're seeing here.
I think you're quite right. Yes, I think you're quite right. He embodies the moment, and the moment is one of tremendous historical change. And the threat that he presents to the liberal global order and its corrupt system, I think, is made apparent by the efforts that they've made, serious efforts, to remove or even kill him. Do you think they'll try and kill him again?
I don't know. I mean, I wrote at some point that the whole past 8 years has been a slow motion assassination attempt. Going back to the Shadowmen and the 1,000-day plan. The lawfare attack, the court cases and the indictments were to get Trump in jail where he could be killed there. Like Epstein was whatever happened to Epstein. Let's do an Epstein on Trump. All that failed. Part of the reason it failed was that Trump and the Republicans were able to get several appointees on the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has shown with its recent decisions, they're not going along with them. They're not going along with the creeping assassination of Trump because it's illegal. It's unconstitutional. It's anti-American. Thank goodness there's a majority of Supreme Court justices, including the much attacked and maligned Clarence Thomas, who were saying, no, you can't do this. This is not what America is. This is not what our Constitution says, that you can stage a slow motion assassination on a major political figure. So it isn't going to happen. What will happen between now and November, I don't know. Nobody knows. And that's part of the drama of what we're seeing right now. What we are seeing is J.D. Vance is coming out of the Republican convention like a bulldog and is going right at Kamala Harris and the rest of the elite Democratic establishment. These people are under civil service, Secret Service protection. And we just saw the failure of the Secret Service to do their job. We know Kennedy's assassination was aided by the Secret Service. So will they be able to penetrate that protective mechanism and get to Trump? We don't know. But they're not going to give up. There's trillions of dollars in looting at stake that the globalists have their hands on. The biggest globalist institution in the U.S. is BlackRock. And BlackRock is literally buying the soil of Ukraine while they can still get their hands on it. And that was because of the globalists' war in Ukraine, led by Biden and Obama. So, yeah, there's a war going on. What will happen? I don't know. Nobody knows. And so that's why it's so important that people like us, like you, like other commentators, keep a focus on this and publicize what's being done. The American people are very angry about this and want something to change. There are ways it can be changed. And I've tried to publicize some of those ways myself in what I've written. I worked with Congressman Dennis Kucinich when he was running for president in the early 2000s on putting together an outline for a completely new monetary system for the U.S. that is very similar to what Lincoln and the Republicans did during the Civil War. During the Civil War, the globalist bankers of the day wanted to use the Civil War to destroy the U.S. Financial system, to destroy the U.S. government and its ability to wage war. And it was Lincoln and the Republicans who used what was then called the greenback system to take over the monetary system, take it away from the bankers, run it out of the U.S. Treasury Department, and that can be done again. And Kucinich entered legislation in 2011 to demonstrate how that could be done. Congressman Thomas Massey, a Republican congressman from Tennessee, has introduced legislation to abolish the Federal Reserve, and it should be abolished. Now, Massey's legislation does not indicate what should be put in its place, but Kucinich's legislation from 2011 is still on the congressional books. It's right there. It creates a new structure of central banking that is controlled by the Treasury Department on a completely different basis than the Federal Reserve that's controlled by the globalist bankers. That's there. That could be done. I have discussed this with Kennedy's people, for example, who have the blueprint of this major change. I would certainly like to get hold of J.D. Vance and have a talk with him. I don't know if that'll happen. But, yeah, our material is being read. So there are things that can be done. But it's a revolution. I called it a new American revolution, and I'm not the only one who's used those terms. That's what we need today, and that's what could happen.
Well, I think what's also interesting about your point of view is that you show the degree to which the American dream has been damaged and replaced by a nightmare. And you show the architecture of America and its origins in that remarkable way that you trace your own origins through the European and American Indian ancestry. But you show that it isn't completely broken, that it can be fixed. It's not just false hope as well, that you have practical solutions as to how to change this permanently for a better world. And this is another thing that I think makes your work so commendable, is that it isn't just speculative. It draws upon real life experience and a deep-seated historical knowledge to present a better future for America. And you think that's realistic?
That's the hope. Yeah, I do. America's a young nation. We had 200 years of history before the U.S. Constitution was written. We've had less than 300 since then. That's not a very long time in historical terms. We're at the beginning, in a way, and maybe a new beginning, because I think there's so many people now who are coming to an understanding of all of this. So, yeah, I do feel a lot of hope.
I wanted to ask you one more question before you go. It's a complex one, but I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about it. Given the speeches that J.D. Vance has made, especially to the Responsible Statecraft Institute and to the Republican National Convention, it's clear that he shares Trump's view that the war in Ukraine is lost and it's a waste of lives and of money, and that Trump and Vance together represent an existential threat to the liberal globalist empire throughout the world. So all the politicians whose careers are staked upon that, from Britain through Europe to the United States, are facing extinction if Trump and Vance win in November. Given that that's the case, do you think that the next 6 months are perhaps some of the most dangerous in our history?
Certainly. Yeah, that's certainly so. And there's another section of my book that I've talked about in interviews that I think is really important. And that is that when World War II was beginning in 1941, the Council on Foreign Relations walked into the White House and said, well, we can help you plan for the future. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations grew out of World War I, and it grew out of the roundtable that was the big project of Cecil Rhodes, Nathan Rothschild, and Alfred Milner, to essentially create a clone in the United States of the British Empire. And what they did was the Council on Foreign Relations got the U.S. government under Roosevelt to agree that the long-term goal of the United States government was to create military dominance of the entire world. And the purpose of that was to, of course, protect monetary dominance of the entire world, because this was a Rockefeller financed institution and project, and the Rockefeller goal was to establish fractional reserve banking based on usury run by the United States over the entire globe. And they got pretty far on that project until they ran into the Soviet Union, and out of that came the Cold War. But the United States continued to put out the policy that their goal was world dominance. It was the Wolfowitz Doctrine of 1991, which said the United States would brook no competition anywhere in the world. Then it was full spectrum dominance coming out of the Bush and the Obama administrations, where it said the United States would brook no competition in cyberspace, in monetary affairs, or in any other sphere of global governance. That is what they used as their basis for moving NATO to the east, for threatening Russia, and for ultimately launching a war against Russia using sanctions, using Ukraine as a battering ram, or any other means they could to break up Russia, because Russia was seen as the last obstacle in the Western world to a complete global takeover. That failed. It failed miserably. And we've been witness to that. And of course, the Biden administration has been the water carrier for that project. And now we're seeing that collapse as well. So yeah, we're seeing, and that's why so many people are saying, is World War III now right around the corner? That's why many people are saying the objective of Netanyahu in Israel is to foment World War III by an attack on Iran. So, and we're also seeing the same thing in Asia, where you've got American military leaders saying, yeah, the next big war with China is 3 to 5 years away. So, yeah, we are at that crisis. Is the world going to go into the big hot war that everybody's been fearing and talking about now for 2 generations? I know you've written, Frank, that you don't think that it's going to happen. I certainly hope it does not. And I think everybody with a brain, including now Trump and Vance, are working to stop that from happening, to resist the voices and the politicians in Europe, in Britain, in Israel, who are trying to foment that war because they know they have lost. They know they've lost the global conflict, and they know the West cannot take over the entire world. That is not going to happen. It's been defeated. The monetary system that requires that to survive is collapsing. And so their level of fear is off the charts. But I think all the people with some degree of sanity, some degree of spiritual values, are working night and day to keep that from happening and to keep all of these flashpoints under control. And so that's my hope. And it certainly does look as though Trump and Vance have that perspective. They're trying to wind down this Ukrainian war. And what Putin wants is a security architecture in Europe that recognizes the multipolar world. That's certainly what I want. And I think it's certainly what the voices of sanity in America want. And those voices of sanity at this time seem to be lodged in the Republican Party. And I have to point out, too, I've written a little bit about this, not a lot. There are forces working behind the scenes, behind the Republican Party, who are trying to bring about these changes. The forces are not really that visible, but there are major figures working behind the scenes, including within the U.S. military, including within the U.S. intelligence apparatus, who are trying to bring about real change in this positive way we're talking about. So one reason I have this optimism, and I've been in touch with some of these people. I know who they are. Yes, I do have hope that there's a strong enough force in America to start bringing these changes about.
Well, it really is a case of balance or Armageddon. And it's extremely encouraging to hear you say that balance has many powerful people on its side, as well as the argument for life and reason itself. Yeah. And I think one of the most important things that you stress is that people must understand today that this really is a question of life or death for the managerial class of the West now. And that if they don't escalate to war, they're finished. And this is what makes the moment so dangerous. And yet, you say there is hope.
Yeah, there is. There's never hope without struggle.
That's a wonderful thing to say.
And we're all in this struggle. We really are. And if you come back to why I wrote the book, I think this is really what is at the bottom of it. Is this struggle that we have to wage for peace, for balance. You're a very good word that you use, for the multipolar world, peace on earth, goodwill to men. I think that's what it comes down to.
That's very much the idea that the political crisis is a spiritual crisis. Would you agree with that?
It is.
It is. I think it is. And I think that if anybody would like to understand the complex forces at play today through the United States empire and its history, they could do no better than read your book. and also your further writings on the subject, because as I said at the beginning, many people do have opinions on the quality crisis facing the world, but few of them have the wisdom and insight and experience that comes from Richard C. Cook. Thank you very much for giving us your time today.
Thank you, Frank. Really appreciate it.
God bless you. Take care, man.
You too. Thanks.